Everyone in Walden Ridge called them saints. The Walthers, the family that donated to every church, every fundraiser, every child's school book drive. But behind the stained glass smiles and Sunday sermons, no one knew their 3 children were locked in the east wing of their mansion, whispering bedtime stories through vents and dreaming of freedom they'd never touched. This isn't a story about villains hiding in the dark. It's about monsters cloaked in community praise, and the children who dared to expose the silence. Watch till the end. Somewhere in this story, you might find a truth your town refuses to see. And if you ever trusted someone too perfect, this story is for you. IT was the kind of morning that made angels weep. The church bells rang not with joy, but with a trembling ache of unseen sorrow. Sunlight spilled through stained glass windows, casting kaleidoscopic halos onto a congregation that worshipped not God, but the illusion of goodness. And at the center of it all stood the Walther family, hand in hand, the very portrait of piety and perfection. But behind every golden donation and every polished sermon was a secret so suffocating. It echoed louder than prayers muttered beneath breath and hymns sung in choreographed unison. Ruthie Walther, just 8 years old, watched from the 3rd floor east wing, her breath fogging the glass as she traced invisible angels on the cold pane, her tiny hand trembling not from the November chill, but from the knowledge that she was not allowed to exist beyond that window, not allowed to wear the Sunday dress her mother bought for, the town's approval, not allowed to walk down the aisle with her siblings, not allowed to sing, not allowed to speak. Because in the Walther home, being seen was a crime and being heard was heresy, and while the town whispered praises over casserole and coffee about how blessed, the Walthers were to donate another $20,000 to youth ministry. No one asked why the family photographs only showed the parents, or why the east wing windows never opened, or why no one had ever seen the children beyond the wrought iron gate that separated their world from the one with laughter, movement, and freedom. On that day, Judith had woken up to sound cathedral bells and tried not to cry. At 15, she had learned to hold silence like a second skin, but Caleb, only 12, had his hands clutched so tightly around his prayer beads that blood seeped from the tiny cuts they made in his palms. Each one a muted rebellion against the scriptures they were forced to memorize, under threat of isolation. Downstairs, Mother was already humming an Oldham while straightening Father's collar, her gloved hands twitching every time he turned his head too fast, as if their dance of control extended even to the subtleties of posture and breath. And Father, the ever-smiling pastor with a booming voice and silver Bible, reminded her that image was everything. "We are God's example, my dear," he'd said once. And examples must be polished until they shine so brightly, others go blind. And perhaps that's what had happened to the town. They had gone blind from the gleam of the Walther generosity, from the $100,000 renovations to the church, from the scholarships for the local school, from the winter food drives funded with bills that bore the fingerprints of 3 forgotten children locked in an eastern prison with wallpaper older than their mother's wedding ring. Ruthie wasn't born broken, but every day chipped at her voice until her only friend became the creak of the floorboards and the echo of Caleb's whispered bedtime stories, stories he crafted from memory to comfort her, because books were forbidden unless they came from Father's curated collection. And Judith, well, Judith hadn't spoken in front of their parents for nearly 2 years, not since she tried to ask about a girl she saw in a picture at church, only to be locked in the east wing closet for 3 days with no food. To purge her of sinful curiosity, Father had said, and yet, on this Sunday, something shifted, not in the town, not yet, but inside Ruthie's heart, a subtle rebellion as she pressed her face hard at the window, catching the glimpse of a boy walking past the church, the same boy she'd seen before, and though he didn't see her, not yet, her heart pounded with a foreign feeling of possibility, of life beyond polished oak pews and measured prayers. Downstairs, the sermon began, Father preaching on love and sacrifice, while the people nodded and Mother adjusted her pearls, and outside, leaves fell with the quiet rage of seasons changing. But upstairs, a child began to dream of escape, not because she understood freedom, but because her soul remembered what it felt like to be seen. The Walther name was more than respected. It was worship, embroidered into the very fabric of Walden Ridge, a small town where reputation meant truth and donations doubled as sainthood. And if you asked anyone from the corner bakery to the mayor's office about them, you get the same warm smile and reverent tone. Oh, the Walthers? A gift from God, really, truly good people. But no one ever asked why such good people never allowed visitors past the front foyer of their sprawling estate, or why no child from the church's youth group had ever been invited to a sleepover at their mansion despite countless birthday parties hosted at the Walter-funded recreation hall across town, where Judith's name was carved onto the donor wall, even though Judith had never stepped foot in the building herself. Because for the people of Walden Ridge, generosity covered sins like snow over decay, and the more the Walthers gave, the less anyone questioned what they kept hidden. They were the kind of family that received applause at town halls without showing up, their absence treated not as aloofness, but as humility. They give so much already, bless them, said a librarian when they donated 1,000 new books, handpicked by Mr. Walther himself, of course, all stamped with Bible verses and moral lessons. But no one noticed the patterns, the way the donations always aligned with moments when questions might have arisen. Like the time a nurse at the clinic asked Mrs. Walther about Ruthie's cough heard faintly through the phone during a call, and the next week, a brand-new ultrasound machine arrived for clinic, complete with a plaque honoring the Walther family's compassion for life, or the time someone from the local paper asked to interview Caleb for an Exceptional Young Minds feature, and the Walthers promptly announced a $50,000 endowment for student journalism, effectively buying silence with a headline that read, Walthers, the soul of Walden Ridge. Even their church, once modest and weather-worn, now glistened with marble floors and golden offering plates, the choir robed in velvet, the altar redesigned by a famous Christian architect flown in from Atlanta, all courtesy of the Walthers. And in return, the church gave them something far more powerful than gratitude. It gave them reverence, the kind that insulated them from doubt, the kind that blinded well-meaning people into complicity. When Father preached, the town listened not to the words, but to the man, his voice like a velvet rope leading them toward an image of holiness so meticulously constructed, it left no room for suspicion. And when Mother sat in the front pew, her hands folded neatly, in her lap, her eyes glistening with rehearsed humility, people wept at her devotion, not knowing those same hands scrubbed blood from Judith's sheets after discipline days, not knowing those same eyes turned cold whenever Ruthie cried too loudly through the walls. The children of Walden Ridge grew up with Walter-funded scholarships, Walter Christmas dinners, Walter summer camps, and so they carried the name like a promise, passing it down without question, like scripture, while their own children began to mimic the same praises. The Walthers are good people, they'd say, and how could anyone argue when the church roof no longer leaked, when the playgrounds were rebuilt, when the food bank never ran dry? No one wanted to believe that their blessings came from the backs of imprisoned children, that the trophies displayed in the church lobby were funded with silence, that the tithes were hush money dressed as miracles. It wasn't just a town that was blindfolded. It was willingly blind, because seeing the truth would require more than outrage. It would demand accountability, and nobody wanted to be the first to accuse saints of sin. Meanwhile, inside the East Wing, Judith was learning to pray without hope. Caleb had started counting shadows to soothe his panic, and Ruthie had begun drawing faces on the walls, friends who couldn't speak but always listened. Once, Caleb had asked Judith why no one came for them, why their names weren't called during Sunday roll call, why the other kids got to wear jeans and laughter, and Judith, with eyes older than her face, had whispered, because they love the idea of us more than the truth of us, and that truth festered like rot beneath the floorboards of a house built on image. Every trophy the Walthers displayed in public, a Best Family Award, a Community Legacy Honor, even a governor's citation, was a nail in the coffin of the children's reality, each one sealing their voices tighter beneath layers of golden reputation. The townspeople weren't evil. They were enamored, and that was perhaps more dangerous, because when evil wears a halo, justice becomes blasphemy. Once, during a fundraiser, a young intern at the church office noticed something odd, a line item on a budget sheet labeled Private Security, East Wing, and when she asked the accountant, he laughed nervously and said, "Oh, that's just for inventory control." Mrs. Walther is very private about her antiques, and the girl, barely 20, nodded, unsure of how to argue with a man who had just written a check for 10 grand to her college, courtesy of the Walthers. That's how it worked. Every question buried under a blanket of benevolence, every anomaly explained away by goodness too grand to be interrogated. And yet, cracks had begun to form, not in the public eye, but in the private spirit of a youngest Walther, Ruthie, whose drawings had shifted from angels to cages, from flowers to walls, from sunshine to one small open window, always high, always unreachable, but always there. And in those drawings lay the seed of something dangerous, awareness, the kind that blooms into action when the right storm comes. And while the town celebrated another record-breaking fundraiser, complete with balloons and an honorary plaque for the Walther family's unwavering spiritual leadership, Ruthie stared out her window at a world that didn't know she was real, that didn't know she prayed not for salvation, but for someone to ask the right question, for someone to see what should have been obvious all along. That generosity without transparency is a disguise, and kindness used to conceal cruelty is the cruelest lie of all. The east wing of the Walther estate wasn't marked by chains or bars, but by the kind of silence that wraps itself around your breath and teaches you to hold it just a little longer each day until your lungs mistake survival for peace. And for Judith, Caleb, and Ruthie, the silence had become their lullaby, their leash, and their language. Judith, the eldest, had once dreamed in color, of stage lights, of soft snowflakes landing on her palm, of ballet slippers that didn't pinch. But by 15, her dreams were monochrome, her voice locked inside the walls with her sketchbooks, pages and pages of faces she'd never seen but imagined to the sliver of light beneath the attic door, because her world had no people, only shadows that moved when father entered, when mother sighed, when Caleb cried again after. Forgetting the second book of the Old Testament during morning catechism, Judith had tried to run once. Not through a window, but through words. She wrote a note, carefully hidden behind the linen closet hinge, asking for help, begging to be heard. But days later, father entered with a note in his hand and fire in his eyes, and that was the last time she spoke without permission. Her silence wasn't submission. It was survival, a compact with the devil she called discipline, and every time she heard Ruthie's muffled sobs or Caleb's frantic whisper counting, she folded her voice deeper into herself, believing that if she bore the silence well enough, maybe God would notice and make it stop. But God, like the town, only saw the stained glass version of the Walthers, not the bruises under Judith's sleeves or the hunger behind Caleb's thin frame or the way Ruthie had begun calling the cracks in the ceiling by name. Caleb, 12 and once ferociously curious, now navigated the east wing. Like a prisoner maps his cell, not by landmarks, but by sounds, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which one screamed, calculating the exact minute the sunlight would reach the far wall, so he could pretend it was a clock, convincing himself that time still passed, that the world outside still turned. Even if their world didn't, his notebooks, hidden beneath the floorboard under the loose tile near the washroom, were filled with escape plans, logic puzzles, and half-drawn diagrams of the vents. Because Caleb didn't dream of love or freedom, he dreamed of breaking the pattern, of solving the problem of their captivity like a math equation no one else had noticed. And yet every time he came close to action, his hands would tremble, not from fear of father, but from fear of failure. Because if he tried and failed, what hope would remain? And then there was Ruthie, sweet, small Ruthie, with her mop of tangled hair and her questions that could shatter stone, the child whose innocence had not yet been replaced by fear, but was beginning to unravel thread by thread. She still drew with crayons, still named the birds she could barely see through the bars of the vent, still imagined that the boy she saw last Sunday might wave to her again, might come find her, might tell someone she was real, because at 8, Ruthie didn't yet understand that the world didn't rescue children it didn't know existed. She had created an imaginary friend named Elby who lived in the wall and listened when no one else would, and she whispered to Elby at night about her dreams. Pancakes with blueberries, reading a book in a real library, having a best friend who would braid her hair and not laugh when she said she liked clouds shaped like animals. Ruthie had begun making invisible maps, tracing imaginary trails from her bed to the front door, from the window to the street, from herself to safety, and though her maps weren't drawn on paper, they were etched in her heart, pulsing with hope that someone, somewhere, might look up and see her in that small east wing. Window and not look away. The children weren't broken. They were breaking slowly, deliberately, by design, under the crushing weight of performative love and biblical discipline that wrapped around their throats like silk ropes, soft enough not to leave bruises visible from the pews, but tight enough to silence screams. Every day began with scripture and ended with inspection, nails trimmed, beds made, back straight, mouth shut, and on Sundays, when the choir's songs drifted faintly through the ductwork, the children would sit in a triangle on the worn rug near the radiator, listening as their parents' praises were sung by voices who had no idea they were praising jailers. Judith would sometimes mouth the lyrics. Caleb would tap rhythms on the floor with his fingers, and Ruthie would close her eyes and pretend she was singing too, but not for God, for herself, for Elby, for the version of Ruthie that ran barefoot in the sun. And yet, even in their captivity, a quiet rebellion stirred. Judith had begun writing again, in secret, crafting poems inside her mind and storing them like jewels behind her eyes. Caleb had hidden a spoon beneath a loose brick, not because it could dig, but because it meant he still had something they hadn't taken. Ruthie had started collecting, yes, little moments when the rules bent. A door left ajar for an extra second, a forgotten lock, a slightly distracted mother, and from those, yes, she was building a ladder in her mind, one that could carry her above the walls, above the silence, above the east wing that smelled like dust and prayers. And as they sat together one cold evening, sharing stolen crumbs of leftover communion bread Judith had hidden in her sleeve, Caleb whispered, "Someday, we won't be ghosts." And Ruthie nodded as if she understood, while Judith, staring at the cracked ceiling above, clenched her fists and swore to herself that when that day came, the world would finally know what it felt like to see them, not as trophies, not as tales, but as children, just children, who had waited too long for the door to open. The east wing of the Walthers estate wasn't marked by chains or bars, but by the kind of silence that wraps itself around your breath and teaches you to hold it just a little longer each day until your lungs mistake survival for peace. And for Judith, Caleb, and Ruthie, the silence had become their lullaby, their leash, and their language. Judith, the eldest, had once dreamed in color of stage, lights, of soft snowflakes landing on her palm, of ballet slippers that didn't pinch. But by 15, her dreams were monochrome, her voice locked inside the walls with her sketchbooks, pages and pages of faces she'd never seen, but imagined through the sliver of light beneath the attic door, because her world had no people, only shadows that moved when father entered, when mother sighed. When Caleb cried again after forgetting the second book of the Old Testament during morning catechism, Judith had tried to run once, not through a window, but through words. She wrote a note, carefully hidden behind the linen closet hinge, asking for help, begging to be heard. But days later, father entered with a note in his hand and fire in his eyes, and that was the last time she spoke without permission. Her silence wasn't submission. It was survival, a compact with the devil she called discipline. And every time she heard Ruthie's muffled sobs or Caleb's frantic whisper counting, she folded her, voice deeper into herself, believing that if she bore the silence well enough, maybe God would notice and make it stop. But God, like the town, only saw the stained glass version of the Walthers, not the bruises under Judith's sleeves or the hunger behind Caleb's thin frame, or the way Ruthie had begun calling the cracks in the ceiling by name. Caleb, 12 and once ferociously curious, now navigated the east wing like a prisoner maps a cell, not by landmarks, but by sounds, memorizing which floorboards creaked and which one screamed, calculating the exact minute the sunlight would reach the far wall, so he could pretend it was a clock, convincing himself that time still passed, that the world outside still turned. Even if their world didn't, his notebooks, hidden beneath the floorboard under the loose tile near the washroom, were filled with escape plans, logic puzzles, and half-drawn diagrams of events. Because Caleb didn't dream of love or freedom, he dreamed of breaking the pattern, of solving the problem of their captivity like a math equation no one else had noticed. And yet every time he came close to action, his hands would tremble, not from fear of father, but from fear of failure. Because if he tried and failed, what hope would remain? And then there was Ruthie, sweet small Ruthie, with her mop of tangled hair and her questions that could shatter stone. The child whose innocence had not yet been replaced by fear, but was beginning to unravel thread by thread. She still drew with crayons, still named the birds she could barely see through the bars of the vent, still imagined that the boy she saw last Sunday might wave to her again, might come find her, might tell someone she was real. Because at 8, Ruthie didn't yet understand that the world didn't rescue children it didn't know existed. She had created an imaginary friend named Elby who lived in the wall and listened when no one else would, and she whispered to Elby at night about her. Dreams, pancakes with blueberries, reading a book in a real library, having a best friend who would braid her hair and not laugh when she said she liked clouds shaped like animals. Ruthie had begun making invisible maps, tracing imaginary trails from her bed to the front door, from the window to the street, from herself to safety. And though her maps weren't drawn on paper, they were etched in her heart, pulsing with hope that someone, somewhere, might look up and see her in that small east. Wing window and not look away. The children weren't broken. They were breaking slowly, deliberately, by design, under the crushing weight of performative love and biblical discipline that wrapped around their throats like silk ropes, soft enough not to leave bruises visible from pews, but tight enough to silence screams. Every day began with scripture and ended with inspection, nails trimmed, beds made, backs straight, mouths shut, and on Sundays, when the choir songs drifted faintly through ductwork, the children would sit in a triangle on the worn rug near the radiator, listening as their parents' praises were sung by voices who had no idea they were praising jailers. Judith would sometimes mouth the lyrics. Caleb would tap rhythms on the floor with his fingers, and Ruthie would close her eyes and pretend she was singing too. But not for God, for herself, for Elby, for the version of Ruthie that ran barefoot in the sun. And yet, even in their captivity, a quiet rebellion stirred. Judith had begun writing again, in secret, crafting poems inside her mind and storing them like jewels behind her eyes. Caleb had hidden a spoon beneath a loose brick, not because it could dig, but because it meant he still had something they hadn't taken. Ruthie had started collecting yes. Little moments when the rules bent. A door left ajar for an extra second, a forgotten lock, a slightly distracted mother. And from those yes, she was building a ladder in her mind, one that had carried her above the walls, above the silence, above the east wing that smelled like dust and prayers. And as they sat together one cold evening, sharing stolen crumbs of leftover communion bread Judith had hidden in her sleeve, Caleb whispered, "Someday, we won't be ghosts." And Ruthie nodded as if she understood, while Judith, staring at the cracked ceiling above, clenched her fists and swore to herself that when that day came, the world would finally know what it felt like to see them, not as trophies, not as tales, but as children, just children, who had waited too long for the door to open. IT happened on a Tuesday, the kind of day that carried no weight, no warning, just soft clouds drifting over Walden Ridge, the kind of weather that masked turning points with calm. And in that stillness, Ruthie did something that would change everything. She cracked the window open, not by design, but by the accidental twist of a rusted handle that had long resisted her tiny hands. And for the first time in her 8 years of breathing behind glass, air rushed in that didn't smell of lavender oil and stale prayer. It smelled like leaves, like dust, like freedom, and it made her dizzy with wonder. She stood frozen, afraid the air itself might scream, might alert Mother to her disobedience. But nothing happened, no alarms, no voice from heaven, no silver Bible slamming shut, only wind, brushing her cheeks like fingers that didn't want to hurt. And in that moment of impossible quiet, she saw him again, the boy from the church path, the one with the messy brown hair and the backpack too big for his frame, the one who always walked a little slower near their house, as if listening for something the rest of the town had long tuned out. She didn't know his name, only that he looked at the mansion the way she did, from the outside, with questions, not reverence. And as he turned toward the sound of a creaking shutter, their eyes met, not fully, just long enough for something primal to pass between them. Recognition, perhaps, or longing. But Ruthie dropped to the floor as if caught, heart thudding like a hymn gone wrong, and crawled back under the bed, trembling not from guilt, but from a feeling too new to name. Later that night, she whispered the encounter to Judith and Caleb during their ritual floor gathering. And while Judith's face remained unreadable, Caleb's eyes, lit with calculation, the kind that meant maps would be drawn again and plans reformed. But it wasn't the boy's gaze that scared them. It was what he did next, because 2 days later, during Father's Sunday sermon, the boy returned, not to the pews, but to the edge of property, where he lingered near the gate, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the upper windows. And that's when he saw something else, a face, a drawing, taped to the inside of the glass, a child's crayon sketch of an open door, and 3 small figures running through it, signed R.W. in shaky letters. And though he didn't fully understand, he understood enough to know it wasn't right. That evening, he brought it to his father, the pastor, who stared at the drawing in stunned silence, his hand trembling just slightly as he turned it over, whispering, This can't be," before folding it into his Bible and locking in his study drawer. A war already began behind his eyes between faith and fear, protecting his flock and uncovering right inside the church he'd sworn to serve. The pastor tried to speak to Father Walther the next day, under the guise of routine counsel. But Father's smile was too sharp, his questions too pointed. "What concerns you about my children, brother?" he asked, voice low and pleasant like honey over a blade. And when the pastor didn't answer fast enough, Father leaned in and said something that made the blood drain from the man's face. "You wouldn't want your sons' scholarships to suddenly vanish, would you?" A veiled threat wrapped in religious benevolence, and the pastor backed away, nodding, retreating, telling himself he needed more proof before acting. But that night, he'd cry alone in his study, not from uncertainty, but from cowardice, knowing that truth had looked him in the face and he had bowed to silence. Meanwhile, Ruthie waited by the window again, but the boy didn't come back. Not for a week, not for two. And she began to believe she'd imagined it all, that the air had lied, that the world was still too far. But Caleb had seen the notebook in the boy's hand, had seen the look of recognition, and he knew they weren't invisible anymore. Even if help wouldn't come right away, someone knew now, someone outside, and that shift changed everything. Judith, for the first time in months, pressed her palm against the window and whispered, "Please don't forget us." Not to God, but to the boy, to the pastor, to anyone who had seen even a flicker of their truth, because she knew it was the only way the cycle would break. Not from within, but from someone strong enough to pull them out. And though nothing had happened yet, not officially, not visibly, the children began to breathe differently, measured, cautious, but infused with the thinnest thread of hope, because once a window opens, even just a crack, the air changes, and so does a story. The drawing should have disappeared, should have remained folded in the pastor's desk like a forgotten scripture too dangerous to preach. But whispers, like water, always find the cracks, and Walden Ridge, so tightly wrapped in its sanctified image, had begun to hear them trickle beneath its polished pews, in the spaces between prayer and silence, in the sideways glances exchanged over communion wine and casserole dishes. And though no one spoke directly to the Walthers, not yet, there was a shift, subtle as a change in organ pitch. First noticed by the deacon's wife, who sat near the front every Sunday and swore she saw movement. In the east wing window, not just curtains swaying, but a child's silhouette, still and watching. She told her husband, voice low and trembling, and he told her not to worry. "Children get restless," he said, even though he knew none of the Walther. Children were ever seen, ever mentioned, ever acknowledged beyond Father's occasional reference to our blessed heritage. Then there was Miss Elaine, the elderly pianist who had played every hymn for 30 years and knew the rhythm of the congregation better than her own breath. She noticed Father's pacing had changed, more measured, more watchful, like a man who suddenly realized he was being watched. And when she brought it up to her sister over tea, the response was clipped. "We don't question people who do God's work." And that was the end of it. But Elaine began skipping services quietly, starting to feel that what echoed to the church walls wasn't always holy. The boy, the pastor's son, had stopped trying to catch Ruthie's gaze from the field, but he hadn't stopped watching. He took a different route to school each day, trying to glimpse the mansion's east wing from new angles, drawing sketches in his notebook that he never showed anyone, not even his father, who had grown more distant, more haunted, preaching with a heaviness that made even the faithful feel uneasy. And though he never mentioned the Walthers directly, he began to speak of hidden sins, of false prophets, of wolves in shepherd's clothing, and the congregation, hungry for clarity but too afraid of division, nodded with uncertainty. Judith, Caleb, and Ruthie didn't know about the sermons or the whispers, but they felt the change, in the way Father slammed his Bible more often, in the way Mother checked the window locks 3 times each night instead of 2, in the way dinner portions shrank whenever Father returned from a tense meeting with the church board, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white on the knife. Caleb overheard a phone call. Father's voice low, sharp, threatening someone about ungrateful suspicion, and God's anointed will not be challenged. And though the words didn't make sense to him in full, the tone did, the fear beneath it, the crack in the armor. Even Ruthie, still clinging to her make-believe world where LB whispered escape plans through the walls, began drawing darker pictures. Figures behind fences, birds with stitched wings, a girl holding a candle that flickered out just before the page ended. And Judith, ever watchful, began to save the drawings, folding them into her mattress as proof, as memory, as ammunition for a future she didn't yet know how to reach. Meanwhile, the church began to splinter, not with outrage, but with discomfort, the kind that creeps in when truth hums just beneath the surface. Too quiet to name, but too loud to ignore. Someone anonymously left a note in the offering plate. "Where are the Walther children?" A single sentence had sent ripples through the administrative staff, who quietly shredded it after a brief, nervous glance at one another, no one brave enough to act. Miss Elaine, after decades of loyalty, quit without a word, leaving behind only a single page of sheet music with a passage circled in red. "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them." And while most assumed it was nothing, a few hearts skipped, a few eyes darted. Because when you've built your faith on the image of righteousness, even the suggestion of a crack can feel like blasphemy. Father, sensing the shift, grew more performative, more generous, announcing new donations, new outreach programs, even a Walther Foundation for at-risk youth, which none of the children in the East Wing would ever benefit from. And the town, desperate to believe again, applauded, praised, offered casseroles and certificates, clinging to the idea that good men couldn't do evil, not if they prayed with the right words and gave the right amount. But the pastor couldn't sleep, haunted by the drawing, by his son's quiet questions, by the silence he'd chosen when his voice might have mattered most. One evening, he stood outside the Walther mansion, hand on the gate, debating whether to knock or walk away forever, and before he could choose, he saw it, a flash of movement in the top window, followed by a small face pressed to the glass, and this time there was no mistaking it, no denial strong enough to drown the truth. There were children in that house, and they weren't free. He backed away again, but something shifted in his heart, something irreversible, and the next Sunday his sermon broke tradition entirely. He spoke of justice, of the cost of silence, of the God who saw behind closed doors, and the church went still, so still that even the children in the East Wing, listening to the ductwork, felt the weight of it. Ruthie clutched Caleb's hand. Judith held her breath, and for the first time, they began to believe that the whispers might grow louder, that beneath the pews where secrets festered, truth had begun to rise, slow and dangerous and unstoppable. Judith had always believed that silence was the safest language, that words, once spoken or written, became weapons that could either save or destroy. But as the air in the East Wing grew heavier and the sermons more volatile, something in her began to shift, not loudly, but with the slow, grinding determination of someone who realizes that hope, even when it's thin and dangerous, is worth more than survival without meaning. And so one night, after the lights were out and Mother's footsteps had faded down the hallway, Judith did something she hadn't done in over a year. She wrote a letter, not a poem, not a secret prayer or a journal entry folded into the hem of her pillowcase, but a real letter to someone outside, to someone who might see the truth and not blink it away, and she wrote it with trembling hands, using the stub of a pencil Caleb had stolen from the study during cleaning day, pressing each word into the paper like a wound. "My name is Judith Walther. I am alive. I am not safe. Please help us." She folded it carefully, tucked into the binding of a hymnal Father had left in the East Wing for daily recitations, and prayed that the next time the hymnals were rotated out, as they occasionally were by the church's librarian or youth assistant, the letter might slip into the right hands. It was a dangerous plan, a fragile one, but it was all she had, and she didn't tell Caleb or Ruthie, not because she didn't trust them, but because if it failed, she didn't want them to carry the weight. Days passed, then a week, then two, and nothing happened. No sirens, no phone calls, no new eyes at a window. But then one Sunday morning, as Judith recited Psalm 23 under her breath for the 100th time, something shifted in Father's voice downstairs. A pause, too long between verses, followed by the sharp closing of his Bible and the unmistakable sound of a door slamming. And for the rest of the day, the house throbbed with tension. Upstairs, Judith pacing short, quiet steps while Caleb counted backward from 1,000 to calm himself, and Ruthie clung to her drawings, asking over and over, "Did Elby say anything yet?" Because even in the rising dread, there was something else blooming, the feeling that their truth had been seen. The following week, a stranger arrived at the church, a woman in her 30s, soft-spoken, wearing a government badge half hidden beneath a cardigan, and she asked to speak with the librarian about a document found in a hymnal, And though her tone was casual, the air around her was thick with purpose, with inquiry, with quiet authority. The librarian, who had found the letter and first believed it to be a prank, now sat pale and silent as the woman asked questions about rotation schedules, about who had access to the books, about the Walther family and their children. And while nothing was confirmed, no name said aloud, something had already begun moving, an investigation, quiet and careful, initiated by the whispered child who had dared to be heard. But Father sensed it, sensed the shift in temperature, the unease in the church staff, the silence that followed his entrance into rooms that once brimmed with eager admiration, and he retaliated not with rage, but with reinforcements, new locks installed in the east wing doors, movement sensors beneath the windows, Bible study extended to 3 hours a day, and even tighter, control of the children's routines. Caleb's spoon was discovered during a room inspection and taken without comment, replaced by a single verse taped to his wall. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. And Caleb, who had only wanted a tool to mark time, now sat staring at that verse like it was a verdict. Ruthie's drawings were burned in the fireplace under the pretense of cleansing temptation. And she cried so hard she vomited, her little fingers searching for Elby in the wall, as if her imaginary friend could shield her from the erasure. Judith, guilt-ridden but more certain than ever, began drafting another letter. This one longer, more detailed, hidden in a second hymnal with information about the layout of the East Wing, the dates of their confinement, the food rations, even the name of the guard Father occasionally hired to watch the hall. And as she slid it into the hymnal's spine, her hands were steady this time, because now she knew someone had read her first cry. Someone had believed her. Meanwhile, the woman from the state began making more frequent visits to town, not to the church, but to the mayor's office, the sheriff's desk, quietly collecting interviews, listening, watching, waiting, and the town began to buzz with something new, not reverence, not doubt, but fear, the kind that clings to your clothes when you realize the people you praise might have been monsters all along. Still, many clung to the illusion, too invested in the Walther mythology to accept the possibility of evil. They gave so much, they said. They loved the Lord. They insisted. But others, quieter ones, began recalling moments, things they hadn't questioned before, odd silences, stifled cries, the time Mrs. Walther refused to let a nurse pass a foyer when Ruthie was allegedly sick, the way Father always changed the subject when asked about his children's schooling. And those moments, once dismissed, now felt like breadcrumbs leading toward truth they could no longer ignore. And in the East Wing, Judith, Caleb, and Ruthie waited, not idly, but with a growing tension that felt like wind before a storm, the kind that makes the floor creak and the windows hum, the kind that told them something was coming, something big, and all they had to do was hold on a little longer, keep the faith not in God, not in their parents, but in the stranger who had opened the hymnal, and saw not a prank, but a child calling for help in the only way she knew how. The morning of the escape attempt arrived like any other Sunday, with the smell of starch and anxiety drifting up the staircase as Mother laid out Father's clergy robes with the same care one might fold a flag at a funeral. And while downstairs the table was set for a post-sermon lunch, fresh biscuits, apple butter, pressed napkins with gold-embroidered scripture, the East Wing buzzed with an energy that was neither reverent nor routine. Caleb had timed it down to the minute. Father always left for church exactly 27 minutes before the service to prepare the pulpit. Mother lingered another 12 to review her choir notes. And Judith had noticed something 2 weeks ago, something small but critical. The lock on the laundry chute hadn't fully reset after last cleaning day. It was a narrow window, a tight plan, and dangerous. Because if even one detail failed, the punishment would not be scriptural. It would be savage. But they had no choice anymore. The second letter was gone. They knew it. And since that day, there had been strange noises at night. Phone calls cut short, Mother's voice trembling just slightly when speaking to Father in private, and Caleb feared that once Father sensed his grip loosening, he would tighten it with force, and so they moved quietly, precisely. Judith faked illness to avoid mandatory morning prayers. Ruthie spilled water to distract Mother near the hallway closet, and Caleb, breath tight and limbs stiff, slid open the laundry chute and wriggled inside. It wasn't long, maybe 15 feet down into the main hallway closet, but in that darkness, every inch felt like miles, and by the time he reached the bottom, his hands were slick with sweat and his knees scraped raw from the rusted metal edges. He waited, one beat two, then slowly pushed open the closet door, just as Judith had described. The hallway empty, the front foyer visible through the gap between the grand staircase and the dining room arch. He moved fast, barefoot, and silent, heart like a hammer in his chest, and reached the door, only to find the deadbolt locked, not with the usual key, but a new code system, one father had installed without warning. Panic surged, but he remembered Plan B. Judith had said the library window, the one nearest the driveway, could still be pried open if the latch wasn't reinforced, and so he ran, as quietly as a child can run through a house built on silence, blood trailing from his knee where a metal shard had torn the skin. And as he reached the window, he heard it, the sound that turned his blood to ice. Footsteps upstairs, fast, deliberate, followed by the low, measured hum of father's voice, no longer preaching but praying, which was always worse, because father only prayed like that before punishment. Caleb's hand shook as he fumbled with the window, praying not to God, but to anyone, anything that would help it open. And as it gave way with a groan, a voice behind him stopped time. "What are you doing?" And there stood Mother, white gloves on, face pale, eyes wide not with rage, but fear, as if she knew that this moment could unravel everything they had built. And for the first time, she did not scream, did not strike, only stepped forward whispering, "Caleb, please, don't do this. We're protecting you." But Caleb, trembling and sobbing now, stared at her with eyes no longer innocent, no longer obedient, and said through cracked lips, "No, you're hiding us." Then pushed through the window, landing hard on the gravel below with a cry that echoed to the hedge-lined yard. Inside, chaos broke. Judith grabbed Ruthie and tried to bolt for the stairwell, but father intercepted them with terrifying calm, seizing Judith's wrist and dragging her into the hallway. Quoting scripture as if reciting a grocery list, "The rod and reproof give wisdom, the rod and reproof." And mother screamed, not in anger, but in desperation, as if something inside her cracked at the sound of the broken window. The sight of blood, the shattering of control. Caleb, limping, made it to the edge of the driveway before collapsing, unsure if he was bleeding more from his knee or from the sheer terror flooding his body, and it was there that someone found him. Not a stranger, not the police, but the pastor's son, who had been watching from the church lawn, notebook in hand, still hoping, still believing that the girl in the window might look out again. And when he saw the broken pane, the torn curtain, the boy stumbling through the hedges, he ran faster than he ever had, shouting for his father, for help, for anyone, and within minutes, the quiet suburb exploded with motion. The pastor arrived, and the sheriff, then the woman from the state, all converging on a house like Judgment Day arriving in slow motion, and inside, Judith screamed as father dragged her by the arm, Ruthie clinging to her waist, and mother collapsed in the foyer, gloves bloody from Caleb's fall, whispering, "I didn't want this, I didn't want this," as if absolution could be summoned in the echoes of collapse. When the door finally burst open, it wasn't with violence, but with a kind of terrible grace. The sheriff walking with a voice that brokered no resistance, the pastor silent behind him, eyes locked with father's in a moment that spoke volumes. Betrayal, disbelief, and the end of denial, and as the children were pulled from the east wing, blinking in sunlight like ghost awakening, Judith kept her head down. Caleb sobbed into a medic's jacket, and Ruthie clutched her torn drawing of an open door, the one she'd hidden in her dress pocket, now stained with dirt and blood, but still whole, and as the sirens wailed and the town gathered, staring in stunned silence at the mansion they'd once worshipped, the truth stood naked and trembling on the front lawn, knees bloodied, hands bruised, but finally, undeniably seen. There was no sermon the following Sunday, no hymns or communion, no talk of grace or sin or forgiveness, just silence, thick and choking, as the congregation of Walden Ridge sat shoulder to shoulder in the pews, staring at an empty pulpit like mourners at a closed casket, each one quietly grieving not just the fall of the Walthers, but the collapse of their own illusions. And outside the church walls, the town pulsed with tension that refused to be named, news vans parked near the edge of the property line, neighbors whispering over hedges, children kept indoors while their parents debated what to believe, what to deny, and who they had become as a community that had praised a prison painted as a palace. Father Walther had been taken into custody without resistance, his Bible still clutched to his chest, quoting verses even as the cuffs closed around his wrists, and Mother, trembling and glassy-eyed, sat silent during the initial questioning, repeating, "We were just trying to protect them," as if she still believed the children belonged more to doctrine than to themselves. Meanwhile, Judith, Caleb, and Ruthie were taken not to a place of healing, but to an overburdened CPS facility 2 towns over. Cold walls, plastic chairs, social workers with too many files and not enough time. And though they were no longer locked in the East Wing, freedom tasted strange, like cafeteria food and fluorescent lighting and the absence of familiarity. Judith refused to speak for the first week, her body present, but her mind still pacing the hallways of the mansion, counting steps, calculating dangers, waiting for rules. That never came. Caleb, stripped of his notebook and his maps, spiraled between compliance and panic, one moment asking for multiplication tables to calm himself, the next screaming at the overhead lights that reminded him of discipline hours. And Ruthie, sweet, shattered Ruthie, spent her days drawing, but the pages were now covered in gray, smudged shapes and tangled lines, the open doors replaced with storms, the birds now cages with broken wings. And every time she asked about LB, a therapist gently reminded her that imaginary friends sometimes go quiet when the world gets too loud. The church formed a committee to handle fallout, official statements, damage control, restructured leadership. But nothing could cover the stain, the guttural shame that clung to the choir robes, the offering plates, the marble floor donated by the very man now awaiting trial for child endangerment, emotional abuse, and unlawful imprisonment. The choir itself disbanded. No one wanted to sing. Praise in a building where children's cries had once echoed beneath the foundation, and Miss Elaine's piano sat untouched, the keys gathering dust like bones of faith no one could play anymore. Some members left the church entirely, unable to stomach their own complicity, while others doubled down, citing spiritual warfare persecution, claiming the Walthers had been framed by a society hostile to holiness. But those voices were fewer each day, their volume no longer enough to drown out the testimony transcripts leaking through the cracks, Judith's trembling voice recounting the lock schedules, Caleb detailing the surveillance systems, Ruthie whispering that she wasn't allowed to own a teddy bear because Mother said it would replace prayer, and the town listened in horror. Each were a stone cracking the stained glass window of their collective denial. The pastor resigned quietly, citing spiritual exhaustion, though some said he had been told to step aside by higher authorities. And in his absence, the church was led by silence, no sermons, no music, just meetings that resembled therapy sessions more than worship, with grown men and women admitting to themselves and each other that they had seen things and said nothing, felt things and dismissed them, praised what they should have questioned. And yet, amid the ashes of reverence, something else stirred. Not hope, not yet, but honesty, the kind that comes only after all pretense has burned away. Children who had once attended youth group with Walther scholarships now asked hard questions at dinner tables. Mothers who had hosted charity events in the Walthers' name now cried in their kitchens, ashamed they never thought to ask why no one ever saw the children at those events. And slowly, painfully, the town began to understand that goodness without transparency is not virtue, it is camouflage. Back at the facility, a new caseworker named Rosa began spending extra time with the siblings, reading poetry with Judith, building puzzles with Caleb, sitting silently beside Ruthie as she drew in silence. And while she never asked them to talk, they began anyway, not because they trusted her completely, but because she didn't demand it, didn't quote scripture or ask them to forgive, just listened, nodded, and told them it was okay to be angry, to be confused, to grieve the version of family they were taught to love. Ruthie gave Rosa a drawing one day, a bird flying away from a broken cage. And when Rosa asked if the bird had a name, Ruthie smiled for the first time in weeks and said, "Not yet, but it's real." And that was the first real step toward healing, small and trembling but real. The choir may have gone silent in Walden Ridge, but in a quiet corner of a government building 2 towns over, a new song was beginning. Not hymns or verses, but of voices returning, one word at a time, learning to speak again without fear. The trial began not with a gavel, but with a silence so thick it seemed to coat the walls of the Walden Ridge County Courthouse, a silence born not of reverence, but of tension, of Community shame of the unbearable knowledge that the town was no longer innocent bystanders but unintentional accomplices to cruelty cloaked in charisma. And when the courtroom doors opened, reporters flooded the pews like modern-day congregants ready to witness a reckoning that would crack open not just the Walther household, but the moral facade of an entire town. Father Walther entered in a gray suit, Bible still in hand, eyes scanning the courtroom not for truth, but for weakness. And when he saw the pastor seated silently in the back row, head bowed and fists clenched, he offered the man a faint, knowing smile, as if to say, "You broke the illusion, but not me." And beside him sat Mother, hands folded, her white gloves gone, her skin bare and trembling, mascara smudged beneath eyes that looked not at her children but the floor, as if seeing their faces might dissolve whatever fragments of righteousness she still clung to. The children were kept in a separate room, for most of the proceedings, protected from the scrutiny of cameras and strangers, but their testimonies were recorded, played aloud to a courtroom so silent you could hear the air conditioning hum. And when Judith's voice filled the space, calm, deliberate, detached from the pain it described, the jury leaned forward, absorbing every word about the locked doors, the timed meals, the scriptural punishments, and the months she spent without daylight while her parents smiled for church photos. Then came Caleb's testimony, clipped and frantic, filled with facts and timelines and quiet weeping when he described the coded locks and the surveillance patterns. And finally Ruthie's voice, soft, hesitant, the voice of a child still unsure if truth would hurt or heal, describing her drawings, her imaginary friend Elby, and how she learned to whisper instead of speak because loud kids go away. And by the time the last recording faded, the room was in tears, jurors, journalists, even the court reporter, blinking fast as she typed. But Father remained still unreadable, as if the pain of his children was not evidence but inconvenience. The defense leaned heavily on religious liberty, on parental rights, on the absence of physical scars, and even dared suggest that the children had been sheltered, not harmed, but their arguments felt brittle, like glass wrapped in doctrine, and cracked further when the pastor took the stand, not as an accuser, but as a witness for truth, and with trembling hands. Describe a moment he saw Ruthie in the window, the drawing, the hymnal, the night he stood at the gate and did nothing, and how that silence haunted him more than anything he'd ever preached. The prosecution's case was built not on one act of violence, but on 1,000 tiny acts of erasure. Children denied identity, denied sunlight, denied love that wasn't conditional. And while some members of the town tried to defend the Walthers, showing up outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Let God judge and not our pastor," their numbers dwindled by the day, replaced by others who came not to protest but to watch, to reckon, to finally look at what they had been trained not to see. Expert witnesses spoke of psychological trauma, attachment disorders, developmental delays, all symptoms the children now carry like invisible bruises. And the judge, a woman known for her stoic demeanor, asked only one question after each testimony. Would you have survived that? And the answers were always silent, always understood. Mother eventually took the stand, tearful and meek, claiming she didn't know it was that bad, that she followed her husband's guidance. But the moment that unraveled her testimony came not from the lawyers, but from Ruthie herself, who asked during a closed-door interview, if Mommy loved us, why did she wear gloves to hug? And those words, relayed to the court by the child psychologist, struck like thunder, reducing any remaining doubt to ash. The verdict was delivered on a gray afternoon, and though the courtroom was packed, the moment felt intimate, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Father Walther was found guilty on multiple counts of child endangerment, unlawful imprisonment, and emotional abuse, sentenced to 25 years without parole, and as the judge read the decision, he remained eerily calm, fingers tracing the spine of his Bible like rosary beads, while Mother wept beside him. Sentenced to 12 years with a mandatory psychological rehabilitation program, her sobs drowned by the closing statement. This court recognizes not just a harm done, but the silence that enabled it. Let this be a reckoning, not just a ruling. Outside, the town reacted in waves, some in stunned silence, some in rage, but many in relief, as if finally naming the horror had lifted a weight no one knew they'd been carrying. And inside the CPS center, when Rosa told the children the verdict, Judith nodded once and returned to her reading. Caleb whispered, "That's one equation solved." And Ruthie drew a picture of a door wide open with a sun that filled the page. No cages, no bars, no Elby. And in the center, 3 children walking into the light, hand in hand, no longer whispering, no longer afraid. It took 7 years for Ruthie to return to the mansion, not as a prisoner, not as a shadow behind glass, but as a young woman with her own car keys, her own nameplate at the local advocacy office, and a manuscript tucked beneath her arm titled East Wing, a story of silent rooms and louder hope, a memoir she had written slowly, painfully, in between therapy sessions and schoolwork, and whisper reunions with Judith and Caleb, who now lived together in a small 2-bedroom apartment filled with secondhand furniture and first-time laughter. But today, she came alone, standing at the rusted gate of the Walthers estate, now owned by the county and overgrown with ivy, its windows boarded, its paint cracked, and yet still standing like a monument to everything the town wanted to forget but needed to remember. She hesitated before stepping in, her hand trembling not from fear, but from the weight of memory. 1,000 echoes stored in the tile, the hallways, the bones of the place, and she made her way through the foyer slowly, pausing at the spot where she had once hidden a drawing of a door. In the corner of the stairwell, a drawing that had long since faded, but whose outline still whispered, "You made it out." In the east wing, she stood in front of the very window that had once cracked open just enough to change everything, and as she pressed her fingers to the glass, now clouded with dust and neglect, she didn't cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because her grief had transformed over the years into something else. Purpose. After the trial, after the foster homes, after the slow rebuilding of trust, she had begun to speak. First in whispers, then in interviews and on stages, and what began as a single child's desperate voice turned into a movement for children trapped in respectable cages, a term she coined during her first testimony to Congress, where she stood in front of lawmakers, hands shaking, heart pounding, and said, "Don't let polished donations silence invisible suffering." And they listened, not all, not right away, but enough to pass a bill funding unannounced welfare checks in religiously affiliated homeschools, now as. She looked out that same east wing window. Ruthie smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet resolve, and opened it wide, pushing against the rusted frame until the breeze rolled in, warm and soft, brushing her face like a mother's hand never had, and behind her, small footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Is this the house, Mama?" a tiny voice asked, and Ruthie turned to see her daughter, 5 years old, cheeks full of sunlight, curls wild and unbrushed, peeking around the doorframe, eyes wide not with fear, but with wonder. "Yes," Ruthie said, kneeling beside her, but only because it's where the story started, not where it ends. And together they sat in the dusty room for a while, reading from the manuscript, tracing the places on the floor where Ruthie used to draw maps with her fingers. And when they left, Ruthie didn't look back, not because she was avoiding the past, but because she had finally learned that healing doesn't come from erasing the story, but from owning it down the road. Judith was teaching creative writing at a community college, using fiction to help teens tell truths they were too scared to speak aloud, and Caleb was working with trauma-informed AI software, helping systems recognize distress patterns in children's speech. His equations now saving lives instead of just predicting pain. Once a month, the 3 of them still met in that same garden with juice boxes and coloring books, not because they needed supervision anymore, but because it had become their ritual, their sacred space, a place where the past and the future shook hands gently and let go. And on the anniversary of the escape, they would write letters to their younger selves and bury them beneath the roots of a fig tree, planted on the day Father went to prison, now grown tall and strong, fruit-bearing in the sun. Ruthie's final letter read, "Dear me, you are not the house you were trapped in. You are the window you opened." And she smiled as she sealed it, knowing that someone someday would read these stories not as tragedy, but as testimony, and maybe, just maybe, find the courage to open their own window too.